In 1961, a British archaeologist was digging through a 9,000-year-old grain bin in Turkey when his shovel hit something. He pulled it out, brushed off the dirt, and found himself holding a small clay statue of a woman, a very confident woman, sitting on a throne, arms resting on two leopards, and, how do we put this politely, built in a way that left nothing to the imagination. And this archaeologist looked at that little statue and thought, this changes everything. This wasn't just a figurine, this was a goddess. And if they worshipped a goddess, then obviously this ancient city was ruled by women. A lost matriarchy. A society where women were in charge thousands of years before written history. It was a beautiful theory. It launched 1,000 books. There was just one small problem. He'd figured out an entire society's power structure from one statue he found in a bin. And for the next 60 years, nobody could actually prove him right or wrong until the DNA came back. And the answer is so much stranger and funnier than either side expected. Okay, let's back up, because this is one of the great arguments in all of archaeology, and it's basically a 60-year-long fight between two groups of people staring at the same pile of ancient stuff and seeing completely opposite things. The place is called Çatalhöyük. It's in modern-day Turkey, it's around 9,000 years old, and it's one of the oldest proto-cities humans ever built. Thousands of people packed into mud brick houses so tightly there were no streets. You walked across the rooftops and dropped into your home through a hole in the ceiling, which is a whole other video. And when archaeologists dug it up, they found female figurines. Lots of them. And the question those little statues raised is deceptively simple. What does a society's art actually tell you about who is in charge? Because that question is a minefield, and humans, historically, are terrible at walking through it without stepping on something. So here's the case for the matriarchy, the women-ruled theory. And on the surface, it's pretty compelling. You've got all these female figurines. You've got the famous seated woman on her leopard throne, looking like she runs the place. You've got a society that, by all accounts, was strikingly equal. The houses were all the same size, nobody had a giant palace, there were no obvious kings, and there were far more prominent female images than male ones. Stack all that up and this was a woman-centered world starts to sound reasonable. Here's the problem, and it's a big one. Finding a lot of female statues and concluding women were in charge is a much bigger leap than it looks. Think about it this way. 2,000 years from now, an archaeologist digs up our civilization and finds 10,000 tiny statues of a muscular man in a red cape. Do they conclude that Superman was our president? We make images of all kinds of things. Heroes, symbols, fantasies that have nothing to do with who's actually running the government. A statue is not a census. And this is where the story gets genuinely a little embarrassing for the scientists, because the man who first pushed the goddess theory was a man in the 1960s. Early archaeologists had a real habit of looking at ancient art through their own assumptions and seeing exactly what they wanted to see. Because for decades, plenty of other archaeologists looked at the exact same evidence and said, not so fast. Their argument was basically this. Look at the actual graves. Men and women were buried in remarkably similar ways. Similar spots, similar grave goods, similar treatment. If women were the ruling class, you'd expect to see it in the burials, the powerful people getting the fancy send-offs. And that pattern just wasn't obviously there. Both sexes ate the same food. Both did hard labor. So the skeptics said this wasn't a matriarchy or a patriarchy. It was something rarer, a genuinely egalitarian society. The figurines, fertility symbols, toys, good luck charms, art, not proof of a queen. And for years that's where it sat. Two camps, same bones, zero way to settle it. Everyone was just vibing archaeologically. And then in 2025, the technology finally caught up. In 2025, a team published something that blew the whole debate open. They didn't look at the statues. They didn't argue about symbolism. They pulled DNA, over 130 genomes, straight out of the skeletons buried under the floors of Çatalhöyük. Because at this site, people buried their dead right inside their home, under the sleeping platforms. Which is morbid, but for a geneticist, it's a gold mine. You can literally see who was related to whom and who lived where. And the result was fascinating. In these households, the genetic thread running through the generations was overwhelmingly maternal. When they looked at who stayed and who left, the pattern was striking. The women stayed. Between 70 and 100% of the time, women remained connected to the house they were born in, while the men were the ones who moved away when they grew up and presumably married in. The exact reverse of what most human societies, where the woman typically leaves to join the husband's family. At Çatalhöyük, the house belonged to the women's line. The men were the ones packing a bag, and the DNA, not a guess, not a statue, made it real. So, case closed, women ruled, put it on a t-shirt? Not so fast. And this is the part I really want you to hear. The scientists who ran this study were extremely careful. They deliberately said female-centered, not female-ruled. Central role, but not a dominant one. And then one archaeologist made the observation that basically detonates the entire 60-year argument. If the DNA had shown the opposite, men staying, women marrying out, nobody would have hesitated for a second to call it a patriarchy. But because it's women at the center, everyone suddenly gets very cautious, which tells you something a little uncomfortable. A lot of this debate was never really about the ancient world at all. It was about us. Everyone saw their own reflection in the bones. So, were ancient societies ruled by women? The most honest answer, the one the actual evidence supports, is this. At least one of the oldest cities we've ever found was built around women, around their households, their bloodlines, their place at the center of the home. Not a throne, not a crown, but the center of gravity of an entire society. And whether you call that ruled by women or not, probably says as much about you as it does about them. Which is maybe the real lesson of Çatalhöyük. We spent 60 years digging up 9,000-year-old people and asking, were they like the story we want to tell? When the more interesting question was always the one they accidentally forced us to ask about ourselves. The people of Çatalhöyük didn't leave us a single written word. No laws, no names, no record of who gave the orders. All they left was their art, their homes, and their dead tucked under the floor. And from that, we've argued for 6 decades about power and gender and who was really in charge. They probably never imagined that the mud brick town where they raised their kids would one day become a mirror, one that every generation looks into and sees, staring back, exactly what it hoped to find.